Hello, everyone. Welcome to this launch event to our fall campaign. I'm just going to give us about another 60 seconds or so for people to join us, those who might be late. And I'm going to shut my audio and video off just for another 60 seconds until to give people an opportunity to join us. So hold on. We'll get started in just a moment. All right. Welcome, everybody. Again, for those of you who heard me a minute ago, and now for those of you who have joined us, delighted to have you with us for this launch event for our fall campaign called Why Classical, Why Canada, Why Now? It'll be an exploration of why classical Christian education is for such a time as this in our country and indeed in our world. We're going to get right to it and straight to the panel. The evening will unfold with a panel discussion first. We'll then talk about our progress in the campaign and our renovations. And then we're going to make an invitation to all of those who are with us to participate in our campaign. Tonight marks the launch of the capital campaign and entitled 7 Weeks for 7 Pillars, the 7 pillars being the 7 pillars of the liberal arts. And each week throughout this campaign, we're going to highlight and unpack one of these pillars. It begins tonight. The campaign begins tonight, October 3rd, and continues until November 28th, which is Giving Tuesday. And I'll give you more information on our campaign towards the end of our gathering tonight. I know there's been some curiosity as to why all the launches for this campaign. I think we had one in November of last year, and then again in the spring of this year, and now one again this October. Our beloved principal gave an excellent metaphor where our campaign is kind of like the Tour de France. One big race, multiple legs, each leg with a beginning and an end. And our fall campaign is one leg of our broad capital campaign. I should warn you, though, that it is likely the steepest leg of Oak Hill's own Tour de France. More on the campaign later. Let's get straight to the panel discussion, which I know we're all looking forward to. Delighted to have this extraordinary panel with our guest host, Davies Owens, host of Basecamp Live, a podcast on classical education. He's also the executive director of the Society of Classical Education. We also have with us Jesse Newton, our beloved principal and founder of Oak Hill Academy, and also Brian Dijkema, one of the founding members of the board. And I know they're going to talk a little bit more about their lives and who they are as they converse together. Davies, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thanks for your willingness to host this event this evening.
Thanks, Greg. It's great to be here with all of you. Thank you for making time on a busy night to join us. Exciting season in life of our schools, Oak Hill in particular. And really, why don't we get started? Just kind of get to know everybody. So maybe, Brian, if you want to start, just kind of a real quick, kind of who are you and how did you get involved in classical Christian education?
Yeah, my name is Brian Dijkema. I work at a think tank called Cardus, and I'm not actually a founding board member. I'm the Nicodemus of our board, somebody who was hanging around for a little while and came actually in the second year. My wife and I decided to come in the second year. We didn't need to be convinced about classical education. We were, both of us read a combination of a book called For the Children's Sake, which I'm sure many of you know. It's a Charlotte Mason primer, and then Susan Wise Bauer when our twin boys were first born, and we thought, wow, this is the type of education we want them to have. And there was a school in Ottawa where we lived at the time, and we sat on the board of that before the kids were even in school. And then we ended up moving to Hamilton and sort of pined for a classical school. And then it started, and we thought, oh man, our kids are in this other system. What are we going to do? And it took us a year to get around. So I will say we're delighted to be part of this school and to be part of education. A word you're going to hear a lot, and you hear a lot from us, is rich. And with our younger two who go to Oak Hill, we have seen how beautiful and how rich that is, and not for any utilitarian reason, but just even in terms of their character and the quality of the art, the literature, the quality of the mathematics, the teaching, the concern for character. So it's been just a lovely thing, and we're just so grateful for it, and glad to be part of this school and in the broader movement too.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Jesse, how about you? Love to hear your story.
Yeah, hey Davies, hey Brian, hey everybody. Yeah, for me, like two parts. As the younger me, as a kid, I always loved learning, and I loved when history came into the math room, for example. I loved math and English. I loved all of it. One time, our middle school teacher taught us. I said, I think we're teaching you wrong. We're teaching you that when you ask a question and get an answer, you're done. But what we should be teaching you is that out of that answer, you should have 3 more questions. And so that helped me start reflecting on it. I remember our first year Bible course, a professor saying that, the Apostle Paul was trained in rhetoric. And I remember thinking, boy, I'd like to learn more about that. I remember being able to expect it to reason well and write well, but not really being taught how to do that. So I think a lot of my education, I loved it, but I also felt like something was missing. And so I had this love for learning, but felt like the ghost of like maybe what once was or what could be. And then as the older me, we got married and working in engineering. My amazing wife, Amy, and I, we had our first child, and we asked the question, what is a school? What could it be? And then when we looked around, and we found there's just a bit of a gap between kind of that question and where we're reading and learning and what we found around us. So we kind of stumbled into classical Christian education, like Lucy stumbled into the wardrobe and found herself talking to a fawn at a lamppost in winter. And everything in me kind of said yes about that. And so it's kind of like the ugly duckling who found his pond, and we found many more ugly ducklings since, and we've been making a home together for a few years now. So
yeah, great story, Jess. Well, I'll share a little bit of mine. I think we all have had that. Most of us today who are raising our children did not have classical Christian education as an option for us, and so we've kind of come into it with stories of contrast. I think of, Jess, you're talking about just sort of what you didn't get. I remember interviewing George Grant on Basecamp a number of years ago, and he said, I felt like I was gypped. Like, you come as an adult to realize what's possible, yeah. And you're like, oh my goodness. The good news is we're here tonight because our children and grandchildren can have this kind of education. My quick story is I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia. Atlanta has got about 100 private schools inside the Perimeter Highway. And I'd had an experience when I was in my late teens. I was at Labrie Fellowship, Francis Schaeffer's International Studies Center, and his daughter, Susan Schaeffer, Macaulay, was there. And she had these younger kids that were putting on Shakespeare plays for fun. They were articulate. They could look an adult in the eye. I was 18 at the time. And I thought, I've never seen kids quite that, well composed and yet joyful. And I said, well, what is that? And she said, well, it's basically a Charlotte Mason classical education. And I was 18 and I thought, wow, I didn't have that. And I don't really need to think about that right now. But fast forward to about 22 years ago, and my 5-year-old was ready for school. We were in Atlanta, and my wife and I were looking around for a classical Christian school. We found this little startup school that was 3 years old and went to visit. I'll never forget the first visit. My wife and I walked in the kindergarten classroom, and all the students were in uniforms, and they promptly stood up, pushed their chairs in, and then looked at us and sort of in one accord said, "Good morning, Dr. Mrs. Owens." And I thought, wow, that is just unbelievable. And my first thought, honestly, was I was kind of uncomfortable with it, because I thought, these are not normal children. They are mechanistic and they're robotic. And I don't know if I want my kids at a school like that. But within about 5 minutes, those kids who had been so polite are sitting on the floor doing this chant, this jingle of a history song, and they were joyful and they were laughing. And I'm like, oh my goodness, it's the perfect blend of order and beauty and aesthetic. At the same time, there is just a wonderful creative spirit of the whole place. And so that kind of got me into it. I ended up, fast forward, on the board of that classical Christian school, Heritage Prep in Atlanta, Georgia, and then ended up as the interim head of school, and then ended up as the head of school. And 22 years later, here I am. But, along the way, I kind of went through a discovery. I think I'd probably, to admit it, I was probably about 2 years as head of school before it finally hit me, what is classical Christian education? And I realized it was way more than just reading, writing, arithmetic. And so probably many of you grew up like I did, thinking school was functionally just as kind of a service provider. You had to change oil in your car, you take it down to the Jiffy Lube or whatever's there in Canada, and it's outsourced. You got to do your laundry, you take it to the laundromat. You got to educate your kids, you take them to the school, they learn reading, writing, arithmetic, they get into a good college, you pay for the service you provide, and that's school. And I had this discovery early on that, wait a minute, no, it's way more than that. It's literally human soul formation. It's 16,000 hours. It's the most important place the child can be. And we'll get into more of that in a moment, but I'm all in, and I'm all excited about it. And maybe kind of just in that vein, Brian, Jesse, maybe if you guys want to take a stab at what is classical Christian, because I never want to assume we all know that. I think we throw that term around, but if you got somebody in the parking lot said, "Hey guys, what is this thing now? Oak Hill's doing what? It's different. They have uniforms. What's classical Christian?" What might you say to answer that question? Brian, you want to take a try at that?
Sure. Well, I'll give you, I work for a think tank for a living, so I could give you the public policy and all that stuff.
Yeah, give me the parking lot. I need the parking lot version.
Okay,
all right.
That's exactly. So I'm going to give you the parents.
Okay, perfect. Yes.
I'm going to, what I typically say to people is, a classical education, and Oak Hill is classical Mason, just like the Susan Schaefer Macaulay bit, that thing that actually inspired my wife and I. I will note, Davies, like one of the things that drew us actually to Oak Hill was we said, what school is likely to form our children in the way that we want to form them at home? And that actually is sort of a tie into the sort of question of what is classical education. And it's an education that is integrated and that sees the student as a person, that is not simply a compartment of body and mind and different subjects that need to be sort of chunked through a system, but that is actually the formation of a person. And that person is embedded in a community that is going to go forward beyond themselves and go backwards into their past. And things like art, science, mathematics, the way we speak, the way we hold ourselves, all these things matter. And a classical education is an education that will work with intention to do that, rather than simply attempt to industrially form the child. And I think that's one of those things. I could get into things like grammar, logic, rhetoric, the pillars that we're going to talk to a little bit more. But when I talk to parents, it's like, it's a restful education where the child is seen as a person and is integrated into a whole, including a temporal whole, its community, and they see their teachers as their teachers are not simply there to fill their minds, but to actually shape them as human beings. And that's usually where I start, because when I start talking grammar, logic, rhetoric, people start to glaze over. But that's how I begin. That's how I begin.
That's good, Brian. Yeah, Jesse, what would you add, or what would you say in the parking lot?
Yeah, well, I'll try and get 3 pictures. So one is the first picture I was introduced to is repairing the ruins. If you think back to Adam and Eve and what was lost in the garden, and that it's not just ignorance. Sometimes we think of education as just correcting ignorance. You know, you don't know something, so let's read this book so we can know something. But actually, education deals with ignorance and sin. It deals with the whole of our problem. And I think that I think especially helpful for Christian parents who maybe haven't thought much about it, or maybe are in a public school setting, to think of how that the schools shape this a child's view of sin, their life before God, that there is a redemptive education is redemptive by nature, or it ought to be. So repairing the ruins of our first parents, and what are they repairing? They're repairing us, as John Milton said, to love, to know God, and out of that knowledge to love Him and to imitate Him, to be like Him. So second one I would say is like it's training our tastes, it's educating our tastes to prefer the right things. So sometimes we don't actually think of that connected to education at all. Again, we think of it just as ignorance. I got to know some stuff, do my multiplication tables, accounting, whatever. But actually, that we ought to prefer what is true, what's good, what's beautiful, to love what God loves. And that doesn't come naturally. Loving God and loving what God loves does not come naturally. Sometimes there's a desire, or a desire to love God and what God loves. But we find we're insufficient in ourselves to do that. So we need to place ourselves in light of God's grace and the ways He has that. Going beyond this is good and this is bad to helping me to love what's good. And I think the third picture I would maybe paint is like connecting knowledge to action. So a few people have talked about this, like sometimes we know what the right thing to do is, but we fail to do it, or even to want to do it. But that is, again, part of that redemptive nature is connecting knowledge to action. And there's a whole big discussion in history here. And the interesting, beautiful thing I think is for a Christian is that it's the faith in Christ that actually connects and heals that broken link between knowing what's right and then living what's right. And then I love the way Society for Classical Learning, I'm just going to parrot from you guys a bit. It's teaching wisdom and virtue, make discernment, order and love to love God through how? Through an ordered exploration of all that's true, good, and beautiful, to better know and love God and people. So,
yeah, Jesse, that's a great answer. You know, I love that Oak Hill has a connection to Charlotte Mason, and I think in the movement in general, Charlotte Mason is very much classical. I don't think there's any disparity there at all. And she's fond of saying, she talks about habit formation, and I think that this is really, for me, kind of in my own journey into education, as I mentioned before, even on the board of a classical Christian school early on, I think somehow I thought Christian education was kind of reading, writing, arithmetic, which is all kind of neutral. And then we kind of sprinkle Jesus on top of it somehow, and that becomes a Christian school. Or a classical Christian school is you sprinkle like really hard books and really difficult things on top of it, and then you've got a classical Christian school, and it's like, wait a minute, the whole thing was a bad model. Kind of throw that out. Mason talks about the importance of habit formation, and she says 9 out of 10 things in life are habits. I mean, when you go home tonight and you brush your teeth, you're going to notice that you're probably starting out on the upper left versus the lower right. I mean, we're creatures of habit. So when you take a child and you put them into an environment for 6-7 hours a day, there is no neutral education. They will become like the people that they're around, and the things that are celebrated and the things that are valued. So, I often quote Augustine, who wrote a people. He says, a people, we may say, is a gathered multitude of rational beings united by agreeing to a shared thing they love. The better the things, the better the people. The worse the things, the worse their agreements to share them. And I mean, that's amazing. That was written 1,500 years ago. And isn't that the state of the world today? I mean, what our children are taught to love and value intrinsically becomes who they are. And so, we'll talk more about, why this is such an important movement. But I think in that answering of the parking lot to what you guys have said, a simple answer I tend to go back to is just, it's classical Christian education is first and foremost, it's forming what our children love through their joyful discovery of the true and the good and the beautiful, to ultimately help a child reach their God-given potential and flourish. And I think one of the greatest sins of the world, crimes, whatever you want to call it, is to see students that are underserved, they're capable of so much that God's wired them for, that are walking out of so many schools, loving that which is not beautiful, and so under incapable of really achieving that which God has made them for. And so I think that formation piece, the habit formation piece, the forming of the moral imagination, we could talk more about these things, but this is the place to be. And I can't imagine a better environment for children today. And that being the case, there's a lot of folks, we'll talk about just the, what's happening in the state side, but, I'd love to hear from you guys a little bit, Jesse, maybe kind of what's happening there in Southern Ontario. It's exciting to see, the growth of classical Christian education, the interest, especially in the last 5 to 10 years. Tell me what you're seeing.
Yeah, I think in Ontario right now we have 10 schools and counting, and there's some schools in different startup modes. There's a lot of classical conversations has a good representation. It's a homeschool kind of co-op, 1 day a week together, 4 days a week at home. So I think the oldest, to my knowledge, school is Our Lady by the Wayside. It's a Catholic classical school, 25 to 30 years old. I think St. Timothy's in Ottawa. Brian's familiar with them. They're, I don't know how old they're, about 15 years, a bit more. Veradea in Kitchener, they converted to classical Christian school, I want to say 10 years ago, but I'm not sure, something around there. Westminster and Nova, they're in Toronto and Newmarket. They're about 9 years old now. Oak Hill's in our 6th year. And then after us, 3 or 4 other schools have started. And 1 last year, 2 this year, and there's a couple in embryo. That's kind of the bigger picture. Then there's like the Oak Hill story as well. How we started. I don't know, Davies, if that's the question you wanted.
Yeah, I mean, I think,
I'm really
go ahead. And then you guys both have different perspectives on it. And Brian, with your kind of larger view of kind of what's happening. But I mean, it's go ahead and talk about Oak Hill. I mean, obviously we're here for your school tonight, and there's obviously a lot of momentum right now, which is exciting.
Yeah, well, I'll give Jesse a moment to catch his breath and have
Okay.
I want to just return,
warm himself out.
Because I actually just want to return just to set the context for something we'll talk about a little bit later, which is some of the, like, how is Oak Hill and its growth situated within some of the broader social changes in Ontario? I want to just sort of set the table for that by harkening back to your bit about Augustine and talking about the community formed by shared loves. And what's fascinating in the City of God, where he wrote that book, he was putting that in contrast to the Roman world, or the Roman understanding of the Republic, the res publica, the shared public space. And he said, the Roman view was one of a community where res publica was one where it was a community of shared interests. And there's that notion of interest versus love. And the Christian tradition was talking about the ordering of loves. And I think, that notion of interests and its role in education is still alive and well. And I think it's one of the challenges with our education system right now. And the way that education is pitched is often in terms of interest, right? So if you go to school, and this is, I think, true on some of the private schools as well. But this sort of narrative is, if you go to school, you get the right education, you learn the right things, you're going to get a great job so that you can earn lots of money, so that you can, and those things are all interests, right? Those are all interests. And love is sort of a sideshow. Love is a thing you do in your own time. And we'll get to that later when we talk about the public policy world and stuff like that. But I do think it's really important to think that Oak Hill, as much as my children are being extremely well educated, like they will hit the A's on those tests and all that other stuff, I don't really care about that. I'm much more interested in the fact that they're being formed well by their teachers and under Jesse's leadership and so on. And I think that's a critical difference that will have implications for public policy down the road. But I'm just going to set the table there and then hand it back to Jesse to talk a little bit about how we got to where we got.
Yeah. Okay, I'll tell that story. There's a prequel that Brian can then tell. Maybe he told it already, but so again, from our family's perspective, we wanted a classical Christian education. Once we were into the wardrobe, there was no going back. So we found a classical school in Toronto, Westminster Classical Christian Academy. We visited a couple times, got to know their principal, Dennis Doty, who's now the head of lower school at Covenant's Classical in Fort Worth, Texas. He messaged me one day in June 2017 saying, Jesse, getting a lot of interest from people in Hamilton. Why don't you put together a meeting? I'll come speak at it and we'll see what happens. So we did that. And at that meeting, met a lot of our founding and same families are at our school still today. We formed a startup committee and we met monthly to Ora et Labora to pray and work and learn more about classical education, figure out how to start a school, and ask God to help us and provide for us. So from there, we kind of, just living room meetings. We formed a board, we incorporated, we did a lot of searching for facilities and turning down and got turned down. We found a facility, we registered our first families. I was hired to be principal, we hired teachers. And September 2018, we opened our doors, year one, day one, to 18 students, 10 families. And now we're in our 6th year. We've grown from 18 to 156 students, from 10 to 68 families, from 4 to 24 staff, JK to 2 to JK to 9, and we're adding a grade a year. And it's been really beautiful. I think one of the ways I've described it, I think what's so beautiful for me is seeing how, the few people at the beginning starting off, and then we're expanding the company, the families involved, the teachers involved. And it's almost like there was like a note or a melody of a song, like a theme song to a movie or a musical. And it's been amazing to see other families and teachers and students kind of pick up the melody, so to speak, and play in harmony with the music that is Oak Hill, that's happening at Oak Hill. And that's not something that like I'm telling them to necessarily do or they're doing. It's kind of something that's been caught, and it's been very beautiful. You see it at our Christmas concerts, and the interesting culture days we have at school, and the sports and the hallway things. It's really beautiful to see the melody being taken up by families and teachers.
I'll add one more thing, Davies, which is that our school is comprised of people, like you said earlier, who didn't have classical education themselves. For the most part, there are a few, and we're really grateful for those who have been deeply involved in classical education or have been formed by that themselves. But what's interesting is that the majority of us who started the school, certainly Jesse and that initial group that started, and the rest of us that have joined since then, are part of it because it's what we wish we would have had. I talk, we did one of the early projects of our school was fixing this very, very bad or a very derelict portable to turn it into classrooms. And we have I think a disproportionate number of tradespeople at our school. And we're talking while we're putting siding on scaffolding that may or may not be up to code. And what was interesting, here we are putting in siding on the wall, fixing this really, what other people would have looked at and said, that thing should go to the dump. But we're like, no, we're going to fix this thing. We're going to make it into a classroom. But what was beautiful, we were talking with tradespeople, said, what, I really wish I would have gotten this education. I wish people would have introduced me to these books. It's so beautiful. The idea that we can go out into nature and we can observe and wonder and ask questions and draw it and observe and attend to it. And I think that's just a fascinating marker of our school. And it's one that many people think classical, and like you were alluding to earlier, Davies, was like just really hard for the real smart, the real smart people. But the reality is most of us are just moms and dads with very, very normal children who we want to love the right things, as you alluded to. And I think that's a very real it's a very real thing in our school. It sort of marks our community. That's one line of that song that I think is very strong.
Yeah. Absolutely. And by the way, let me just inject, I should have said this at the beginning, kind of as we go through our format, we're going to continue to present and answer questions, the three of us, for probably another 20 minutes or so, and then maybe 25, and we're on a roll. But I definitely want to leave time at the end for those of you who are attending to be able to offer questions you may have. So there's a Q&A box at the bottom. Anytime along the way you want to start putting questions in there, we will get to those here in just a bit as we go through this process. I think that the question that I put out there was just kind of what's happening in Canada. Obviously, I say obvious, it's obvious to me because I live in this every day, but the good news is that there is I think a revival going on, I think spiritually in many ways. And I think God's using classical Christian education around the world. And it just by way of encouragement to those of you who are listening, when you're kind of living in one school community, you're Oak Hill, you're in the minivan, you're kind of doing the thing, you're like, you don't often back up and realize there's something significant happen around the world. And I think, you could point fingers back to maybe it was during COVID. I think in some cases it was sort of this, I call it the big reveal to so many Christian parents that were understandably trying to be salt and light parents out in the government schools and trying to, for all those right reasons, but all of a sudden they're looking over the shoulder of their child's laptop thinking, wow, that's what's being asked of them in terms of the academic expectations, maybe some of the political expectations being infused into the curriculum. And so I can say for sure in the US, there has just been a overwhelming interest in classical Christian education. It's starting to snowball. And, to the point where so many schools I know are just simply out of space and starting to figure out how do we start, not only our 5-day-a-week program, but you're seeing the rise of the collaborative hybrid type models, which is a beautiful blend of homeschooling and traditional brick and mortar school. There is homeschooling, of course, that's growing. So it is sort of what I think of it in kind of the biblical term of this idea of like a Kairos moment, kind of this very specific appointed time that God has said, it is now time to change a generation. And as we've talked about, really at the heart and soul of our culture is the restoration of family, and family is strengthened not only through church, but through this organization we call school, where we come together again for 16,000 hours. And if you look at it from a pure math standpoint, I don't see any other, basically you got 24 hours in a day. How many hours are children asleep? Hopefully 6 to 8 hours or something. And then other than time on technology, which we can talk about, which is really robbing so many children today, that influence of school is so, so important. And so I really believe that that's what we're seeing here in the US through the Basecamp Live podcast that I've been doing for 7 years. I have listeners all over the world, and I'm always amazed at people who are emailing me from Colombia and South America or Kenya and Africa. I've had the privilege of being in Africa and Rwanda 4 times, and just the schools that are growing there. Rafiki is one organization among many that's doing great work. I also see just incredible growth happening in inner cities. So the stereotype for years was that classical Christian schools were sort of the more affluent, comfortable suburban families and their brick and mortar schools. It's that, but it's everybody. And, I could point to many examples of that. And I think it's just, again, a bit of a Kairos moment for us here that we're experiencing God doing great work. I'm anticipating maybe Cardus will do this, Brian, is kind of go back and let's really get some hard numbers, because there's so many anecdotal examples of startup schools that are coming to us and other organizations saying, hey, what can you do to help us? There's 4 families. We've got to do something different. Let's get started. So we know there's a lot of movement right now. Maybe Jesse, Brian, back to you. Again, I just want to make sure we have time specifically thinking about the rise of class and the interest of classical Christian, specifically in Ontario and in Canada. Talk a little bit again, Brian, you started talking a little bit about public policy. Just what are some of those shifts that maybe you're seeing that are causing that curiosity, that interest in alternative education?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I appreciate the desire for numbers. It's something that we've done a little bit, and I'll share a little bit of those, but I will just alert people on this call to an event that Cardus is going to be doing with one of Cardus's senior fellows. And actually, I'm not sure what to call her, a godmother of this school, Dr. Deanie Van Pelt, who's a Charlotte Mason specialist. Somebody who, frankly, you really just a privilege to be able to sit and ask her questions with. She's been involved with our school. And Dr. Van Pelt is going to be actually giving a speech on November 9th on the future of education in Canada that actually brings some of these numbers to bear. And I would encourage all of you to sign up for that. We can put that out there. And Davies too, if you want to share that with your people. But what I will say is that we know for certain, Cardus did a paper called Naturally Diverse that tried to get over the myths of some of the things that people assume about independent schools. A lot of the myths are that they're for rich people only, and that they're just cliques, they're little cliques, they're for rich people only, and so on. But the data don't bear that out at all. If you look at the independent school landscape, you'll see that it's increased by over 51%. I think it's about 52% since the last time it was measured, which was in 2014 or something like that. So there's been a massive boom in independent education. And I think there's a variety of reasons for that, and I'll get to that. But just to describe the type of growth, it's not growth in places like Appleby College or Trinity or Upper Canada College, where you have to be earning, in the 1% of Canadian incomes to get into those schools. There's only been one new, what they call top tier schools. They make up only 4.2% of independent schools. The massive growth, the majority of growth has come from what we call new special emphasis schools. And it's interesting. Oak Hill would be one of those, ANOVA, all those ones that Jesse mentioned. Those are all special emphasis schools, and 32 of them are new religious schools. So it's not even just faith-based people who are, or faith-based schools that are forming. More and more Ontarians, and I know this is true in Alberta as well, as we're starting to do some of the research, are beginning to realize that what they've been told about public education, that it's just the place you got to go, the sort of the things that you talk about, the habit, Davies. I think for many parents, the habit was you have kids, when they get to a certain age, you send them to the local public school, they go and they go down that path and so on. I think a variety of things have led people to realize that there are actually more options out there. And I think part of the challenge has been a lack of imagination. Jesse talked about getting into the wardrobe. You could use a different analogy that, you know, the sheen has come off, or the scales have come off for a lot of people. I think COVID, you're right. They saw the nature of the curriculum, and regardless of their opinions on questions relating to sexuality or whatever ideology that, you know, has come up and is often a hot button issue in our day and age, people realize this education is not all that good. The child is being treated like an automaton, and I think more and more families across the spectrum, across the religious backgrounds or not at all, are realizing that there's a new way to do education. And we're seeing that across the board in Ontario. If I'm not mistaken, Ontario families, like as a percentage of the total enrollment of K to 12, it's up to 7%. And that's up from 4.1%. That's in what might be the least helpful political or policy environment in our country. One could even say that it's hostile. I wouldn't quite go that far, but if you're certainly looking, or you're comparing it to Alberta or British Columbia, Quebec, other places where there's far more support for independent and pluralist education, Ontario is one of the hardest places to send your kids to school as far as money and other things are concerned. Yeah. And yet you've seen massive growth. And I think part of that is parents waking up to a new way to educate. And I don't want to simply badmouth public schools. I'm a product. I went to Thousand Island Secondary School. I loved it. I received a decent education, and a large part of the decent was my own faults and not doing homework, and, you know, the wasted youth and all the rest of that stuff. But I think people are realizing we can do more, we can do better, and we can do that on our own in our communities rather than having to wait for the state to do that.
Yeah, that's really encouraging. And I think there is an awakening and a rediscovering that education, again, as you were saying, Brian, it's not just reading, writing, arithmetic, and the yellow bus and the apple on the desk. And, you know, and I think that's the hard thing, is that we experience life the way we grew up. So we think that school is the same, but I mean, that is probably the big, like so many things in our culture today, don't assume that whatever was in the case 20 years ago is how it is today. And yet, you know, I often think about him, we keep using Lewis and analogies of wardrobes and things, but, you know, he also he wrote a good bit about education, like in his book Screw Tape Proposes a Toast. Think about this is like 1948. He's saying that really, you know, if you want to destroy a culture, you got to get a hold of the education system. And so, I mean, he was predicting in 1948 what was going to happen 20 to 50 years later. So, you know, I think of kind of that idea of like the cut flower, like my generation came through when there were still vestiges of Judeo-Christian values, and, you know, whatever it was, 10 Commandments or pledge, you know, those things were still part of the ethos of the school. It's changed so much. And you know, and I had an experience a number of years ago, speaking again to my African journey and the spread of classical Christian around the world. I was, you know, unfortunately, Rwanda in 1994 experienced a horrific genocide. You know, it was 1 million people killed in 100 days. And I remember going through the genocide memorial, and it was fascinating because the first big display cabinet is, why did this happen? And within that display cabinet are the grammar school books that were used in the schools that basically indoctrinated the children, that said the reason you're having problems is because this other group of people is causing the problems. And so it doesn't take a lot of formulation of these impressionable children that by the age of 18, it made perfect sense to pick up a machete and go after your neighbor. So again, Lewis is right that this is not just a polite thing we do or an important thing we do to get our kids ready for a job. This is forming the very nature of their soul and their being and how they understand themselves and the world around them. So this is such important work. And and we're a part of something that's transformative. And so I'm seeing some great questions coming in. Keep posting those. I want to maybe just by way of kind of storytelling, because we all could probably talk about stories, and we could spend the rest of the time doing that. I you know, Brian, Jesse, you guys are living this out not only as educators but as parents. I mean, I would just put a plug in and say, as a dad of 3 children, that little girl that I was looking for a school for in Atlanta when she was 5 is now 26, and I've got a middle son who's a senior at Baylor University, and my youngest is now a sophomore. You know, I used to joke, I'd stand up at open houses and I'd talk about the wonders of classical Christian education, looking at my oldest being in 3rd grade going, I sure hope it's as good as I think it is. And I can honestly say all my children have gone through K-12 classical Christian. They are wholly different in their ability to just confidence, their ability to articulate, have a conversation, their work ethic. I mean, there's something, and yes, I'm a bragging dad, but I see this across so many of our schools where the fruit is profound and significant. Do you guys want to just say something about, I mean, maybe give some anecdotal stories of kind of transformed lives that have lived through this amazing education?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to share a few. I was thinking about this. This is such a big, important question. So the first that came to my mind was just talking with a parent who's new to our school this year, the son in our middle school. I said, how are you enjoying your time? How's it working out, the change? And they said, yeah, it's really good. And they asked their son, like, what are you enjoying, or how's school going? And he just said, well, I think he volunteered this. He said, Mom, I love Bible class. And she goes, oh, that's good. And so yeah, like she goes, like, what's different? Well, my other school, we were just kind of like Bible class, like fill in the blanks. But this class, like, we're opening the Bible and discussing it and talking about it and hearing teaching on it. And so his love for the Bible has been rekindled. And then the other thing she said is that he was out setting snail traps in the backyard, and I think through our nature study, other things. So she said the significance of those 2 pieces is that his spark had kind of come back or was rekindled, and just a love for just the ordinary, the magic in the ordinary.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've seen that a lot. I was talking to another parent, and they were just in a restaurant, and their little daughter, grade 1, was looking across the restaurant, and they saw a picture on the wall, and they're fascinated by it. And she started describing and studying this picture out loud and asking questions about it. And you know, they do that in nature study, a picture study. They do a formal picture study and learn. So they kind of seem like trivial little things, but I think what I find beautiful about those couple stories is they just see glory in the ordinary, and they have an interest and a life for many things in life. And I think when you care about things around you, then it helps you to kind of care, be a good steward, and be interested in people. So
That's good.
I can keep going with other
Yeah.
kinds of things, confidence and learning how to speak
Yeah.
well, and making eye contact with adults, but maybe I'll pass it around for.
I'm still back on the snail traps. I think that should be on the front of the website. That's a reason, right?
Yeah.
You'll keep your lettuce healthy in the.
There you go. I mean,
you know?
I mean, no, but I think it's beautiful. Nature studies, absolutely. You know, how many kids today are on screens all day long and they didn't know snails even existed in the wild? I mean, there's so many advantages. Brian, any stories that come to your mind?
Well, yeah, I mean, some very similar. I mean, the one just on snails is talking about I know we're going to just stick with this. The I believe it's the Fibonacci curve, and the sort of beauty of the fact that you're actually doing ratios, mathematical ratios. On the back of a snail, right? And then also of a sudden noticing that on paintings, and kids being able to point that out. You know, hey Dad, that snail, that sort of spiral on that snail, did you know that you can see that in this painting? And they will go like that and sort of point that out. And there's a certain even delight as a parent. You know, I feel like there's a delight. Like I always say to people that one of the best things about having children is being able to read to them and rediscovering all these beautiful, wondrous living books that our librarian, and shout out to Andrea Penoyer and Maria Van Bentham for filling our library with such wonderful living books. But that's one of the best things. But it's almost like the education itself, and being a parent of that child is a rediscovery of that wonder, just a personal thing. I will note, Davies, and I really like, you know, as the parent who's, you know, on the board, I'm always going to say the good things about the school. But I want parents to know, if you're new to classical, this is not a magic bullet, right? There's a sense in which kids are still going to wake up and they're like, oh, I don't want to go to school today. And, but I look, and that happens in my household. There are mornings when it's tough to get everyone out of the bed. But I will say there is no snuffing of the flame that I've seen in other places. There is a sense in which we had this article in Comment Magazine about somebody who talked about the humanities, and he talked about getting university students in first year of university. And he said, most of these children have had wonder ground out of them in high school. And the metaphor is just, you know, a grinder that just sort of like flattens any sort of love and wonder. And you say, like, we're teaching astrophysics to children who have never seen the stars. And what I love about Oak Hill is that, and my children exemplify this when the way they talk about nature, about art, even with the way we talk about a movie or something that we're watching, that wonder has been maintained and sort of fanned at Oak Hill. And that's a very real thing. There is something really tragic about seeing the wonder of the world and the delight in the world ground out of kids by having to fill in blanks and having to do just work for the sake of it rather than simply.
Right.
I will say that that's one thing that we've seen for sure. It's been, they came in with flames and they've only grown brighter, despite sometimes being a little foggy on early mornings.
Yeah, I think that, Brian, that's a really important point. And we're going to get to questions here in just a moment. But I think that, you know, again, most of us didn't grow up with this. So perception sometimes outwardly looking in is like, gosh, they're wearing uniforms, you know, which, you know, that's again, so many things are countercultural, and that's a wonderful thing. We could talk about uniforms. I have a whole podcast on that, but, you know, and they're reading old books. There's not enough pictures. Captain Underpants seems a lot more exciting than, you know, Grimm's fairy tales or something. Like, why are we doing all of this? And you find out that the very thing that they're concerned about, it's the opposite, which is they love this. These chants that are boring to us as adults in grammar school are fascinating, and they love memorizing these things. When they learn formal logic in middle school, that's not tedious. They're deconstructing fallacies, and they're taking delight in that because it cuts to the grain and the age and the stage of the child. And I would say ultimately, isn't that what our culture needs right now? And I think back to that issue around why it's growing is because increasingly, you know, I think at one point 10 years ago, we were people would pat us on the head. You're the kind of fusty, sentimental throwback Amish school thing going on down the street. Now it's like, wait, I saw your kids, and they're markedly different. I think about a story of a business owner in Boise, Idaho, where I am, that number of years ago, he was at a local baseball game, and he didn't know anything about our school, but he was sitting behind several of our students. I think there were 4 girls. It was on a weekend. They weren't in uniform, but just the way they comported themselves, they weren't head down on the phone. They weren't snarky. They weren't attitude. They were kind of joyfully interacting with each other. And so after the game, he just went up and he said, where do you go to school? And they said, well, we go to the Ambrose School. It's a classical Christian school. He said, I knew something was different about you. And I think more and more that's starting to happen, because they've had to work hard, which sometimes is perceived as, and there can be rigor, can become rigor mortis. We joke about that. Like, okay, let's don't just cook them in the books, but let's not do what the world says, which is just let everybody off easy. And that's kind of modern education, is, you know, the teacher's the guide on the side and the student's really in charge. And what do you want to do today? And lower the bar. And like, no, we have students that want to rise up to, again, their God-given potential. And they're people who can work hard, and they have character, and they know what civil discourse looks like. And aren't these the people you want to hire? I know a patent attorney here in Boise. He will only hire classical Christian students because of their work ethic and their thinking ability and their resources. The world is increasingly saying, you are offering something that we want. And I would just, one more footnote to make this point. I did a podcast 2 episodes back on the rise of AI. Everybody's afraid of AI right now. And I would say, in some ways, bring it on. You know, I don't know if this is really a good idea, but it'd be interesting. What if AI wrote the senior thesis for all of our students? Wouldn't that be an interesting model? And then get this, we turn around and say, okay, student, I want you using all of the skills of logic and rhetoric and everything you've been trained in. I want you to orally deconstruct what's in that AI written paper, because you should be smart enough to find out where the computer failed, to make the right connections and weave the right ideas, because you're sharp enough. So now all of a sudden, our students are even more unique and more desirable because they're not just information absorbers. And why do you want to go to school anyhow if it's just information? So all that to say, I get excited about this. We're doing something that is very significant. What you're doing at Oak Hill Academy is more than just a local school doing things a little differently. This is kingdom work. It's significant work. It's what's going to, I think it's the last best hope for our generation and generations to come. The challenge is it's a long process over 18 years, but boy, when they come out, it's encouraging. So any comments on that? And then we'll get to questions. Jesse, Brian, anything before we get to questions?
I was just gonna share some more stories, but maybe I'll see if I can weave them into the questions. But yeah, no, that's really beautiful. It's really good.
Okay,
I
great.
think
Yeah,
the
go
one,
ahead, Brian.
yeah, that's the one thing is like I'm always a little so I'm a went to Redeemer, did liberal arts, and I loved it. It was world changing for me. I'm always, you know, it's one of those things, it's a challenge in our day and age. We talked about interest as well, right? And one of the things when we're like, this is just Jesse and I on our board, we want kids. So when you say this lawyer will only hire classical kids, and I'm like, well, heck yeah, I understand that. especially with law, right? There's a
Right.
you know, especially with law, you want somebody who understands logic, rhetoric, and grammar, and
Sure.
just grammar of law and so on. But I want to say to you, and I look, I just say, take for granted that your child is going to be just fine in the workforce. Take for granted that. Let's remember, and there's I think a question I'm going to sort of allude to get to the answer of it, maybe preemptively answer, is like 30 years down the road, you're a long way from education. I'm currently a long way from my education. And what I take delight in my work, I love my job at Cardus, and I love my people. But the things that have stayed with me for the longest in terms of the satisfaction of my life, how do I love my wife? How do I understand my parents? How do I understand the natural world? How do I think about the political realm? All these things that occur outside of my work, right? These parts of my life that are not covered in my sort of technical skills. Those things that bring me delight are things that I have in part because I have been educated liberally. I've been given those gifts to think through those things, to take delight, to hear music, to listen to it. And I think so I love the pitch of, and I'm not saying you're doing this, Davies, but I love the pitch of course classical kids are going to rise to the top. There's plenty of evidence that shows that they lead in businesses. Kids who are liberally educated lead in business and politics and so on. I'm not at all surprised by that, and we shouldn't either. But the one thing, if you're a parent, you want to say, what's the long-term trajectory for your kid? What do you want for them? Yes, of course, it's nice that they might be a CEO or they might be a prime minister or a premier or something like that. But you want them to live a full life where they can take satisfaction in their toil and the whole thing, the love of God that will shape them. And I just think that the type of education we provide at Oak Hill, and that classical schools like yours, Davies, and that the majority of them within the movement are actually doing that. And I think that's sort of like it's almost a bit like Solomon. You get this beautiful wisdom, and the riches are sort of like, that's kind of a side benefit, right? Like it's like the Lord said to Solomon, because you asked for wisdom, I'm going to give you gold too. And I feel a little bit that's the sort of the nugget of Oak Hill and classical education. It's the beauty of wisdom, and the other stuff kind of comes too, and it's amazing.
Yeah, no, that's, and I think it's a really important point, because again, I think the stigma is often this is, we're just trying to get in good colleges and it's all about CEO level leadership. I mean, it's not. It's about when, and I often say to parents, like, college is a bar way too, like, that's a given. They're going to get into a good college. The real question is who they're going to be when they're 50 or 60 and they're facing difficult ethical question or a sick child, or, I mean, how do you navigate life and truly flourish is what this is really coming down to. We're getting some wonderful questions coming in. Why don't we kind of rapid fire through these, because we could spend another couple hours delving. These are amazing questions. So let me just put back to you guys, because it's specifically a question around Oak Hill Academy. What is the prerequisite for families to attend the school? Is there something specific you look for with families?
Yeah, great question. For details, you can see our website, but basically we look for a mission fit. So we want families to just make sure we have our school's values and our goals for our students. Are they shared by the family? Do they want their students to know and love the Lord? Do they want them to have a rich and appropriately challenging education? They want a low-tech education. We don't have a lot of screens, a lot of time with books and papers and playing and relationships and drama. So we first look for just make sure that we want the same things. And then another part of that then is an academic placement test. We just want to make sure we want students to love learning. So, and we love what we're good at. Plus provides a little bit of challenge. So, you know, sometimes we've experienced students who are in one grade, but maybe academically their best fit would be a lower grade. So that's part of the assessment. Yeah, so that's the heart of it is we want the same things, and then we have a conversation from there.
So I'm going to try to group these questions. I'm going to stay for a minute in just kind of the vein of kind of Oak Hill questions. So another person was asking just, I'm an interested parent, but concerned about cost. How does the price point compare to other private schools? And I know that's, again, a broader question is like, this is an amazing education. How does this work in context where there's not a lot of resources? And again, the answer is there are amazing schools and places that where there are very limited resources, specifically with Oak Hill Academy. Maybe Jesse or Brian want to talk about that for a parent that's curious.
I'd be happy to do that. We at Cardus have done some research on the cost of independent education in Ontario, and the range is pretty big. It ranges from about $652 to, you know, almost $30,000. We'd be just below the median there, and so we are, you know, if you're comparing us to public school, we're going to be more expensive. But if you're comparing us to other Christian schools, other independent schools, we are sort of average. And so we'd be happy to talk details. There's some stuff on our website as well, but we're certainly not in the range of a place like Upper Canada College, which is one of those elite prep schools that we talked about, the top tier one, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And I think this is partially one of our sort of desires for our community, is that there are various ways for support as well. We work with Christian School Foundation and a number of other foundations. So if there's a need, we try to address that and ascertain your needs and your abilities to pay and so on. So we would say to them, don't let money be the first stop. And I would say, but I would also add, there's a study that came out today by Stats Canada that talked about the cost of raising a child from 0 to 17, and it was some astronomical number. But the minute you start to break it down and you say, okay, on a year-by-year basis, it costs X to raise a child. Going back to my Solomon thing, let's say the cost is $10,000 or $14,000. It's important. That is a cost. I want to be very real about that. That if you're working hard for your money, it's not always easy to come up with that. And Ontario, as I noted, provides zero support, and they're alone, almost virtually alone in the nation of Canada, not providing any support. But I do encourage families to say, okay, if you need that money to live, then we have to find ways to help you and so on. But there are priorities too. And one of the things that we noted in our Cardus studies is that many families who send their kids to Christian school or independent education are actually just making choices about what they do with their funds. And so you'll find that these families don't go to Florida on March break. They drive a secondhand Dodge Caravan. Come to our parking lot. You'll see it. Like, do you know what I mean? There's a sense in which they don't go out for restaurants very much. And I'm not suggesting that everybody's capable of living that way, but I do think that it is one of those things. It's like if it's a priority for you, then it can be a priority for us, and we can help with that.
Well, and that's as you're sharing that, Brian, I'm thinking about a story David Goodwin, head of the ACCS, told to me not too long ago. He was flying in a plane coming back into Boise, and the guy sitting next to him, they were just chatting, and education came up, and David mentioned he was a part of the Ambrose school, and then the guy immediately said, "Oh, that school, it's too expensive." And David said, "Well, have you ever looked at it?" He goes, "Well, I know it's expensive. It's a private school. I can't go there." And David was like, "Well," and this guy was apparently a believer and just was so quick to dismiss it. And so, I mean, I think that is the challenge, is to first of all, wait, hold on a second, to your point, why should this be a priority for your family? And then if it is, go have a conversation with the school, because most classical Christian schools I know will do amazing things to try to make it work. I know of individuals out there at other schools that that are well off, and they've made it their mission field just to send students to classical Christian schools. So I mean, you just never know how God will provide in those instances. So it's
And
really
churches have done a really good job in Hamilton. I think they're starting to as well realize that this is actually part of their discipleship as well. And I know that there are some churches who contribute funds to the local Christian schools, and so that may be something as well to talk about. The church, how that community can support it.
Great. Let me jump we'll come back to some specific Oak Academy questions, but kind of move back out to just Canada and Brian, some of the things that you were talking about. A question came in just asking, is there any influence from the government on curriculum? I guess let's answer that first, and then we'll go to another related kind of question.
Well, Jesse, do you want to tell the story of our, it's a great question. And Jesse, maybe you can tell the story of our high school, which is a sort of a direct question, and some of the answers that may give some indication.
Sure. Influence is just such a tricky verb. So I'm tempted to say no, but I don't know how it's being interpreted. But no, we, in Ontario, you don't have to, for K-8, you don't have to follow government guidelines for curriculum. So we've crafted our own, and, we've not just kind of rogue and, imagining things, we've done our research and whatnot. So we don't, but with high school specifically, we started grade 9 this year, or kind of soft launching it. And we, in Ontario, in Canada, if you want to go to university or college, you have to have the diploma issued by your province. And to do that, you have to be an inspected school. And in Ontario, that means going through the Ontario credit system. And there's predefined courses with objectives. So initially, we want to say, okay, we want our students to have a great education, plus we want them to have doors open to them beyond school. So we were looking at, okay, let's look at mapping our curriculum to the Ontario high school credit system. And we started doing that, and it looked okay. But then we realized, we had to make more compromises, and it's a lot more work than we realized. And then the government also just mandated a new grade 9 course, which is, and maybe it was a good thing. Maybe I'm not too sure, but it just suggested to us, our map could be changed at any moment from a new mandate. So then we did more research. We're like, there is a path for independent or homeschoolers or mature students to university that's not through the diploma. And so that was really encouraging. Then we talked to a bunch of other Christian high schools in Ontario who's been doing this for many years. They're also uninspected, and they just told us, except for one university who doesn't accept anything but the Ontario diploma, they've had no troubles getting students into the program of their choice or scholarships. It just required a little more work or relationship or even marketing of their students to the registrars of those universities. So yeah, and we're exploring as a board alternative accreditation, where we will have oversight from, I know SEL is piloting accreditation, or ACCS, where we can have someone who is of the same mind and mission of us to help us be just a better, not only Ontario school, but to be a better classical Christian school.
I will say too, Davies, and I think this is an important point to note, is that just because we're independent does not mean we're not public. And I think that's a really important thing to note, is that we are educating citizens of Ontario, and we take that very seriously. We take that as a public responsibility, that when we're, as parents, we're not just educating for our families, not just for a church, but citizens of this province. And so that means that we're not intending to be a hermetically sealed vault off from the public. We want our children to engage, and we understand the role of government, and we're happy that the government supports education in this province. I think one thing that our research at Cardus has shown is that independent schools, far from being these sort of self-interested hives, they're actually bigger contributors to the public. They tend to volunteer more, they give more to charity, including charities that are non-religious. And I think that's the vision we have. So we're publicly minded. We just think the curriculum is probably best to stick with the classical rather than try to go with the boxes given to us by government.
Makes sense. Well, we are looking at having crossed the hour mark, and I want to be respectful of people's time. There's some amazing questions here. We need to do like a part 2 on this thing, or maybe we'll just roll this into a Basecamp Live podcast. We'll entitle it "The Questions We Didn't Get To" and make this a full episode, because these are great questions that I'd love to jump onto, but I know everybody's got lots going on. Any kind of final word from you guys? Just a kind of final thought before we roll it back to Greg? Jesse, go ahead.
Um, I just want to say, come visit Oak Hill. I think you can read about it. For me, I listened to Joe Boot, convinced, yes, there's no such thing as a neutral education. I read Douglas Wilson, Lost Tools, Recovering the Lost Tools. And then I went and visited Westminster Classical Christian School, and to me, it was just like, breathing life into and animating what I've been learning. So I would just invite anyone to come visit Oak Hill anytime. You can spend some time with us. And we're not perfect. We're very much learning. This is a generational project. But we have open doors, open arms to come and see.
Great. Wonderful. Brian, any parting words from you?
I would say come and see, and also come and listen. One of the best places that, there are times when, say someone is ill and a board member is in just being there. One of the great delights of the school is just listening to the soundscape of the place. And you can tell a place that's full of anxiety and a place that's full of peace and joy. And when I go to Oak Hill and listen, it's like a brook. It's like being in the woods. There's babbling, there's chirping, but it's not chaos. It's harmonious. There's something beautiful about it. And I'm looking forward to even more moving into our new building, and thanks to all those who are thinking of contributing to our campaign and who've already done so. I think there's a way in which even the place is a place of peace, and that's our goal. And just please come and see and listen and maybe even taste if some of the kids are cooking. So
wow. Well, I can't wait to personally visit. And I know of many adults who've said, when I walk into a classical Christian school, my heart rate drops a few beats, just because there is calmness and order and there's hope. I mean, I think, again, it's really easy to get discouraged, and you go see, look what God's doing with this next generation through schools around the world. It's encouraging news. So again, I'm grateful for all the work all of you are doing at Oak Hill Academy. I'm glad to be a part of the larger movement. Come join us on Basecamp Live. We'd love to have you, as we just each week talk about what God's doing across the world at schools like yours. It's a very encouraging time. So thanks for the evening. I'm going to turn it over to Greg just for some final words here.
Davies, special thanks to you for being part of this. Idaho's a long ways away from us. You didn't have to do this, but we're deeply grateful that someone who has contributed so much to classical education in the US and Canada would be part of us here. Yeah. Jesse and Brian, you two represent the courageous and visionary leadership of our school, other members of the board and staff who are responsible for where we are today as a school. And I want to say thanks to you for being so articulate in defining who we are and what we're up to. And thanks to all three of you for being part of this evening. Now, the rest of you, do not go away, because everything they have said up until now is lost if you don't listen to these last 5-10 minutes. Okay, so stick around. We're just going to get, as I said earlier, tonight is a launch of our fall campaign. It's the third leg of Oak Hill Academy's fundraising Tour de France. So it is another launch of another leg of our 2.5-year capital campaign. And as I said earlier, the theme is 7 weeks for 7 pillars, and you can see there the 7 pillars of the liberal arts that we're going to be exploring during the course of this campaign. But we're also going to be reaching out to you during this campaign to help us in what is becoming a very challenging moment in the history of Oak Hill Academy. And I'll get to that in a moment. But before I do, and yes, this is about fundraising, just in case you're wondering, this is a launch of a fundraising campaign, and we're going to ask for your help tonight. Just before I give you the context, a progress report of where we're at in the campaign and in the renovation, I just want to set a lens through which to see this campaign, because money is a complicated thing, and it's a very personal thing. And if you're being asked, or if you have to ask for money for even something as valuable as Oak Hill Academy, it can be uncomfortable, and it can be complicated, and there can be tensions, there can be we're all affected by money in different ways. But I want to provide, I want to set the lens for our campaign as the lens of love and devotion. Oak Hill is a work of love, a love for our students, love for our world, a love for God. As one Oak Hill teacher said, all education is about learning to love God, love ourselves, love our neighbor, and love the world in which God has made. Asking for support and being asked for support is an extension of that love. Both of those things, the asking and the giving, the asking and the being asked, are both acts of love and devotion to God and his kingdom. So as we go through these next 7 weeks, if it should get exhausting over being called or being invited to an event or some sort of giving opportunity, see it through that lens of love and devotion. Okay, let me give you a little context of where we're at in our capital campaign, and then we're going to get specifically down to this fall campaign and talk about that. So let's look at context, overall progress of the campaign thus far. So our capital campaign goal is 5.6 million. Many of you have heard this before. Funds raised, gifts and pledges that we're at 2.9 million in our first 12 months of what is about a 27-month campaign. 31% of our Oak Hill families have given, which is great, and we're deeply grateful for that commitment. 7 Oak Hill families have given 2.5 million, which means that 10% of our Oak Hill families have given 85% of the funds received so far. Now, let me just say all of this is a good picture. It's a good picture of how far we've come and how far we need to go. Let's move on to the next slide. Just take a brief. Now, I've set a specific date here, and I realize that later on that it might be off, but this now puts the fire under the feet of Mark and Henry Skiltice that our move-in renovation should be completed sometime in November, towards the end of November, but November 15th, you'll see on your screen. And by move-in renovation, that doesn't mean that everything that needs to be renovated will be done. It means that whatever we need to do to move in, to get that the government to say that yes, we can move in, will be done in November. And it's thanks to our board, to school leadership, and especially to Mark Nevin and Henry Skiltice for the way, and to God for the way in which miraculous things have happened and enabled us to get this done as quickly as we've been able to. We have much to be thankful for. Despite the success that we've experienced, much of the funds that we've talked about that you can see is in that $2.9 million is in the form of pledge. And also we've already expended funds in the purchase of the school and already in the renovation. Our immediate challenge is cash flow. And we need $500,000, which will, by the way, release another gift of $500,000 that's waiting for us to raise this $500 in this campaign. We need $500,000 to give us the cash flow to complete the renovations for November. We have 69 families, and that amounts to about $7,250 per family. Now, it's obvious that not many of us, not all of us, have the capacity to give that amount towards our campaign, and that's completely understood. We may have some who can afford this amount over the course of the next 15 months, paying on a monthly basis. We may have some who can afford this in a one-time gift, and we may have some in our midst who have the capacity not only to give this, but to also compensate for those who are unable to give. But this just gives you a sense of what we're needing. What we do need is for every Oak Hill family to either pledge or give during this next 7 weeks. We need that. So we could, and we're inviting your help in 3 ways. And let's look at that. First of all, it's we need your prayer. And I know that can sound cliche in a Christian organization to say, please pray. But we have already seen the work of our Lord providing in ways that were unexpected and unseen. And the work that's been done in our renovation has happened so quickly. The documents that needed to be approved by the city happened unexpectedly quickly. There are so many things that have come together in the creation of this new school for Oak Hill Academy, that it's a sign that prayer works. And we need to continue to pray. The second way in which we need your help is helping us identify those either in your network or beyond your network who you think have the interest and the capacity to give to Oak Hill Academy. Our community alone is 69 families and their extended families, but still not sufficient to meet the goals of this campaign. So we need to broaden our base of support, and we need your help in doing that. And I'll get to sharing with you how you can do that in just a moment. And we also need you to give. We need your financial support. You'll find a QR code here on the screen in front of you. This opens a window to either giving right away today or whenever you're able to pledging and stating what the pledge will be, and giving us your email address, and we'll follow up on that, or to meet with myself to talk about a grant, or to talk about someone you know who you think might be interested in our school and has the capacity to contribute towards our fall campaign. Please click on that QR code. It will just open up all the options in front of you. And we would love to hear from you tonight. Let me just say this. If you respond tonight, that means that nobody's going to call you or back you into a corner for a meeting at, I don't know, Stack's Pancake House in Ancaster. If you respond tonight, we'll just respond with a word of thanks and acknowledgement of our gratitude for your gift. Finally, a reminder that on this lasts from October 3rd to November 28th. You'll be invited to either a phone call. If you don't give tonight, you'll be invited to a phone call, to a face-to-face meeting, or to a gathering that some of our ambassadors, and we're calling those who are reaching out to each of you, our campaign ambassadors. Some of them will be hosting gatherings at their home, and you'll be hearing more about that in the coming days. Reach out to us, give, send me a note, help us expand our donor base. Have a conversation with me. I'd be delighted to meet with any of you to talk about where we're at and where we're going. And especially remember that asking, being asked, and giving is an act of love towards our children, towards our country, towards our future, and towards God and our world, the world that He has put us in. And it's an act of devotion to Him and to His kingdom. So as we reach out to you, as we invite you to events or to give, hear us, see what we're doing through that lens. And let's see what our Lord does in these coming days. 7 weeks for 7 pillars in this campaign to raise $500,000 to help us with our cash flow. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Take a picture of that QR code. We are delighted to have you with us. And Davies, Brian, Jesse, thanks again for an excellent conversation about why classical, why Canada, and why now. God bless you, be with you, and give you peace. Good night.